Last year, I think I opened by saying what an incredible year the previous year had been. But, brothers and sisters, 2017 has been an absolutely incomprehensible year, really. The number of events that have taken place in the past 12 months and continuing to do so as we go into the beginning part of 2018 is absolutely amazing. And yet we aren't amazed, are we? Because we know the angels are working to bring about God's purpose. And they're working so hard behind the scenes to make sure the right people are in the right place at the right time. And as Brother Clive said, that work can take place 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s years beforehand to ensure that everything drops into place. And we do marvel that God is in control. And we take great comfort and hope in that. Well, an awful lot has happened, so obviously we've got to concentrate. So I thought we'd take the two themes which form the cover on Milestones this year, featured two incredible things. The first was Mr. Juncker's speech, State of the Union speech, whereby he set forward the dream that he had of the United States of Europe, with its army able to stand on its own feet in defiance of America. And the Daily Telegraph cartoonists picked it up and depicted it as a Roman emperor addressing his citizens. And that was so spot on, because we know that what is happening in Europe is the arising, the forming of the beast. And that is very much a Roman symbol. It's the power of Rome. In the language of Daniel chapter 2, the iron of the legs goes into the feet, part of iron, part of clay. And we're seeing formed the final depiction of Nebuchadnezzar's image, the forming of the 2 feet, and this is the western foot. So it's quite remarkable that he picked upon a Roman emperor, because that was so spot on. And the other item, which has already been touched upon by Brother Philip, is Mr. Trump's declaration that Jerusalem was the capital and that he was going to move the embassy there. And that gives us our two areas that we will look at. We're going to mainly look at Europe, what's happening in Europe, this forming of the United States of Europe, and then look at events of Israel and the Middle East. So let's now look at Europe. It's been a remarkable year for this coming together of Europe, determined to build themselves as a United States of Europe. It's a dream which they've had for many years. The founding fathers, all the while, they understood that this was going to be the final end. When we've finally got all the steps in place, then this is what will emerge. And that, of course, is what was kept from the British people when Britain entered the EEC, as it was so many years ago. But we've seen in the past year this big drive, and that's what we want to look at. And parallel with that has been Brexit, and Britain's made very little progress, and we shall see the reason why in a moment. And at a speech that Juncker gave, 17th February, we have made more progress in European defence policy over the last year than in the last 20 years. And that was a very true statement, as we shall see. So an intense drive to this United States of Europe. And we know that has to be so. Europe has to be united, and it has to have its own army, because we know from Scripture that the beast is going to join with the dragon, and the false prophet is going to bring them both. The 2 feet of Daniel's image is going to be projected into the land of Israel to do battle. And therefore, Europe has got to have a military power. We know Russia has already got one, but Europe needs one as well, in order that they might gather the nations to the Battle of Armageddon. And then when we come to chapter 17 of Revelation, which is beyond Armageddon, Armageddon has taken place, the cream of the Russian army has been destroyed on the mountains of Israel together with the European confederates. So Europe, big drive, build an army. We saw that one, so let's put my clicker in, then it will advance. So we looked at that. So yes, we looked at Revelation and saying that it is necessary that not only Russia, the dragon, has to have an army, but also the beast has to have an army. And when the dragon has been destroyed, then it is the beast in Revelation chapter 17 that is making war with the Lamb. So we expect to see Europe as a common entity, a beast system, a Holy Roman Empire revived with its own army and military might. So in the terms of Daniel's image, as we said, we've got these three elements at the time of the end. We have the dragon, we have the beast, and we have the false prophet. And they represent the feet of today being formed. This is what we're seeing formed. The dragon its foot has been much more in advance of the beast's foot, but it is coming at a pace now. And it's interesting that all this is happening as Britain is on her way out of Europe. Britain has been the brake that's held back Europe from developing its own political systems, because Britain has been opposed to it and very, very much opposed to Europe having its own army. That's the role of NATO, says Britain, and so has opposed any steps. But now Britain has no influence or power in the EU, then they can forge ahead. So what is so interesting is to see this connection between the legs which held up the image in times past, in the Holy Roman Empire and onwards, to see the connection between them and the newly forming feet. And again, what is so interesting is to see the importance of World War I, and that the effect of World War I affected both sides, and it also brought about the beginnings of the preparation for the restoration of the nation of Israel. And so it's interesting, in Revelation chapter 16, the one thing that is picked out for the sixth vial is the drying up of the river Euphrates, which we know equates with the events of World War I. And we can see just how pivotal it is, because it brought to an end the western side, the last of the emperors, the Holy Roman Empire was broken, French Revolution and that, but it stumbled on until the last monarch of the Habsburgs, Charles I, resigned in 1918. And we know how Hitler tried to revive that Holy Roman Empire of the Germanic peoples, but that was not to be because the time hadn't come. And then Britain joins and holds them back. And now Britain is leaving, then it can form. And it's so interesting, as well as seeing this coming together as a unity and having its own army, pushing towards having its own army, is the growing influence of the papacy in the affairs of Europe. If we look at the eastern foot, the Russian foot, again, it was in the same year that the Tsar, in fact, they're just going to have their celebrations, commemorations of the ending of the Tsar system with the murder of Nicholas II and his family. And again, we can see how communism was put into place to hold back the development of another Tsar type of system, because the time hadn't come. Israel hadn't gone back to their land as a nation. They were beginning to go back, but it had to wait until Israel was a nation for the steps to be taken for the forming of the feet. And with communism being overthrown in 1991, then we've seen in Russia very strong progress towards the birth of a new Tsarist system. Putin himself models himself upon the Tsars. And again, we see the connection between the church and state. The power of Rome, as revealed in the Russian Orthodox Church, is very much advanced compared with Europe. Now, so going back to the western leg, very much at the heart of it all is Germany. And Germany is the biggest of the EU populations by reason of her reunification of East Germany and West Germany. That made her the most populous state in the EU, and that obviously carries its clout. But if we think of GDP, which is how one normally measures the strength of a country, we find that Germany is number 4 in the world. USA, China, Japan, followed by Germany and the UK. So she is the strongest of the EU countries as far as economy is concerned. And very interestingly, she has been on a drive to gather up gold from around the world, and she has the second largest gold reserves in the world, so that if the euro crumbles and she decides to go back to a Deutschmark and invite other nations to become part of a Deutschmark system, she will have the gold to back it. Whereas America and Britain, we don't have the gold reserves to back our currencies. So that will put her in a very strong position. And as far as her exports are concerned, she again is number 3 in the world. China, United States, followed by Germany. So a very strong position. And it's, as I said earlier, the strength of Germany, and combined with the Brexit, has powered this drive to have an army. And if we just look at the Brexit timetable, the Brexit vote was taken in June 2016. The Article 50, which was the triggering of Britain leaving, which started the countdown, 2 years from then, Britain theoretically should have left. And in between is a negotiation stage. And negotiations have to be wrapped up by at least October of this year, because each of the 27 countries has to take whatever is hammered out back to their own parliaments and agree them, so that come just before the 29th of March, they can all get together and agree the terms. And if just one nation says, no, I don't agree to these terms that you've made, then the whole lot crumbles. So time is running out. And we have seen that the EU has prevaricated and isn't keen at all to help Britain to leave. Now, if we just slide that down and then just look at the timetable for the forming of the United States of Europe and the talks for that, it's very interesting. It really kicked off in March of last year, when the 27 members, Britain didn't attend, went to Rome to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the founding of the EU. And they went to Rome because that's where it all began. But again, we see the significance, the linkage all the while going back to Rome. That's what it's all about, Rome versus Zion. And so that was the 25th of March. And then Juncker, the EU commissioner, he, every year, like the Americans or like the Russians, gives a State of the Union speech. His speech the year before had been very downcast because Britain had just voted to leave and the economy was suffering and things were pretty grim. But in the year in between, things had improved considerably. There has been an improvement in the euro and the economies of the EU. And so he had a very upbeat address, which we will look at in a moment. And that was followed about a fortnight later by the new French president, Macron, again setting out his vision of what he wanted to see as far as the EU was concerned. Again, we'll look at that. And then in November, the EU leaders met PESCO. We shall look at what PESCO is, but this is to do with the coming together of the military, unification of all the military systems for the different countries of the EU. And that was a very important meeting. That was the 13th of November. And then in January of this year was the 55th anniversary of the Merkel-Macron, well, it wasn't in 55 years ago, can't even think of the leaders, but they came, being de Gaulle's day, wasn't it? They came and buried the hatchet between France and Germany, no longer rivals. They were going to pull together and going to build a peaceful Europe. And so on this 55th anniversary, Merkel and Macron came together and pledged that they were going to build upon those foundations. And then the 16th of February was the Munich Security Conference. All these we shall look at, and so that will have more meaning in a moment. And then the first PESCO meeting was on the 6th of March, just this week. And again, a very important meeting that was. So we can see there's this acceleration of things happening, driving Europe onwards to form this union. So let's go back to that meeting, 25th of March last year, the 60th anniversary of the founding of the EU in Rome. Now, they put forth, at the end of that, a declaration of where they were planning to go. And this is a summary of that declaration. John Redwood is one of the UK MPs. He writes a daily diary on EU matters. Fascinating thing. I put quite a lot of his little bits in snippets. But he summed it up. The Rome Declaration says that the construction of European unity is a bold, far-sighted endeavour. So the whole drive of this declaration was we're going to be more united than we are now. So his comment was, now we know what the EU wants without the UK. The Rome Declaration, signed last weekend, sets out the full scheme for the Union. It is, as Eurosceptics described. As the Declaration says, we have built a unique union with common institutions and strong values. Unity is both a necessity and our free choice. Our union is undividable and indivisible. A stronger Europe in the global scene, committed to strengthening its common security and defence with a common defence supply industry. He says it was the creation of a large new state, after all. That's what the Founding Fathers wanted. They knew they had to do it secretly because people wouldn't swallow it whole, but step by little step, they have come to where they want to. So that was followed by Juncker's State of the Union speech, which was headed, "Catching the wind in our sails." We're beginning to move. Now, the fascinating thing is that when one looks at continental cartoons of Brexit, it's a picture of Europe leaving Britain behind. It's Europe that's sailing away from Britain. Whereas when the British look at it, they are looking at Britain sailing away from the EU. It's just the two different concepts. But the wind is in our sails. We're making progress. Let's move on. And this is just a summary of some of the points that he made in his speech, that East and West Europe must breathe with both her lungs, the Balkans and the whole of Europe must be united. We need, by 2025, a fully fledged European Defence Union, stronger bonds in economic and monetary union. Everybody's got to join the euro, no opt-outs in the future. And as just a passing thing, no EU membership for Turkey for the foreseeable future. And that led to the cartoon in the Telegraph of him making his vision, his State of the Union vision. As I say, a fortnight later, Macron, newly elected, young man, full of energy, determined to make big changes in France, which he's managing to push forward so far. It's got a long way to go. But again, his emphasis, he wants to see a Europe with a profound transformation, deeper political integration. They're now much more open about it. We are one nation. We've got to integrate. And one of his schemes for achieving that is that students in the future EU should go to universities in other countries, learn other languages, but get to feel that They are not French and German and Italian. We're Europeans. This is what they're pushing for. And is even calling for pan-European political parties. So when they have the European parliamentary elections, each country sends their representatives, but he wants, in addition to that, to fill the gap that's going to be left when Britain withdraws, to fill that gap by parties which represent the whole of the EU. It's just fascinating how quietly and step by step and stealthily they're going that way. Deeper Euro integration he wants, and a European defence force. So Stratfor summed up those two speeches, which had come very close together, the grand plans to renew the European Union. Both speeches have served their purpose to jumpstart discussions of deeper integration and to outline the grand plans for reform that Europe so desperately needs. So Stratfor and America recognised that Europe was intent and was working to building this European Union of a political union. And sure enough, they are pressing ahead. So on the 13th of November of last year, the heads of government, the 27, Britain wasn't involved with this because she was leaving, but the other members, with one or two exceptions, little countries, they took this historic step. It was headlined towards a united military. The problem with Europe at the moment is that each country has their own standards. So if you're building a tank, well, you have a German tank, you have a French tank, you have an Italian tank, and of course that leads to great costs. So this PESCO is to unite and, right, we'll have one tank and we'll all build that model. And PESCO, which is Italian for a peach tree, they put soft outside as a peach but has a stony heart. It is from the initials permanent structured cooperation. So they're all cooperating together and setting out the standards for the military of the future. Now, of course, this is something which is of great interest to Britain. Although she's not part of it, she has a very strong military weapons industry. And if standards are going to be laid down, she wants to be part of that. But as we shall see in a moment, 2 slides on, she's got to wait. So this was heralded as a historic moment in European defence, a milestone in European development. And this was a summary of it. 23 European Union member nations took a major step toward forming a European army on November 13th. Meeting in Brussels, the nations agreed to coordinate their defence spending and planning in order to boost the fighting effectiveness of the EU as a whole, rather than designing their militaries only to defend their individual borders. This is a beast system being formed before our eyes. We're seeing individual nations giving up their independence to work as a whole. And I thought this summary by this chap, Apostolos, I won't pronounce it because I'll only do him injustice, but he was writing about what's just taken place. The EU leaders are planning a massive arms build-up. Both the financing plans and institutional infrastructure for such a consolidation of European military policy are being put in place at an astonishing speed. Billions of euros have been put on the table for R&D and weapons procurement. Plans to militarise development aid, circumvent constitutional restraints, and bring European forces to the battleground are on paper and ready to go. So they left no stone unturned to get to this position where they can push forward rapidly. So we jump now to this year, to the 19th of January, and this meeting of Merkel and Macron in celebration of the 55th anniversary of the Elysee Treaty. And the summary here is, this is from German Foreign Policy. Berlin and Paris would like their alliance to be regarded as a motor for further European integration. This is the in-word, integration. The new treaty aimed at a prosperous and competitive Europe, more sovereign, united and democratic. Well, you can forget about the democratic part. The leaders are calling for deepening their cooperation to not only include finance, social and economic policies, but also foreign, defence, security and development policies, as well as the fight against terrorism and crisis management. This would enhance the Berlin-Paris axis as a central power structure of the Eurozone. And Europe, driven by France and Germany working together, will move at speed. And that was followed, about a month later, by this Munich Security Conference. Now, this isn't a governmental thing. This is privately organised in Germany, obviously Munich, but the military might of the whole world comes to this annual conference to look at how the world is going and how they can put it right. And it was rather a dismal meeting because with all the input that they had, they came to the conclusion things are only getting worse and there is no real solution to the problems the world has. But the politicians as well as the military attend. And the European politicians were trumpeting at this conference of the great steps that they had taken to defend Europe against any threats. And so the German defence minister, we have paved the way politically to establish an army of Europeans. And the Polish Prime Minister, Europe needs more steel tanks and fewer think tanks, which I thought was a lovely one. And again, the German Foreign Minister, in the foreseeable future, the EU will be able to build up its arms to such an extent that it will no longer need US support. That's what they want. They hate, especially under Trump, they hate the Americans. They want to be independent. They know that they can't ever match the might of Russia, but if they can build up their strength and then work with Russia, then they will be happy. And this is where the European junctor made his remark that we made more progress in European defence policy over the last year than the last 20 years. So they agreed at their first meeting, which was earlier this week, to 17 collaborative projects. So they worked very swiftly. And it was interesting that Euractiv, which is just a European magazine, very only concerned really with European matters, but it says that Brexit indeed has been an accelerator. The European Defence Fund, prepared in only 5 months, that's when Juncker talked about this is what we want, in the 5 months they've set that up, is of unprecedented scale, both in terms of financial means committed and the perimeter of activities envisaged. So it's saying, it's incredible the speed and the drive that there is. Now Britain's on the way out. And they agreed at this meeting, although Britain wanted to, play a role, that Britain would have to wait until the end of the year. In other words, Brexit talk should then be over, and they'll just see which way the wind blows. So Britain really is being excluded from this. This is part of their drive to get rid of Britain. Now, what we've been seeing in the past 50, 60 years are the steps to statehood, nationhood. The EU has been steadily enlarging, and that's what you need. If you're going to have a state, the United States of Europe, you need territory. It's been enlarging that territory. You need to be able, as in America, to travel from one state to another without even knowing you've gone from one state to another. And that they achieved in 1995 with the Schengen Agreement, allowing free movements across the borders. You also need a common currency. You don't want to change currency at the borders of each little state. You have one common currency, and they achieved that in 2002. And you need an army, and that's what the last final straw they have achieved last year. So we see the building of the United States of Europe with its army. And just last week, end of February, was an announcement that NATO is putting in a new headquarters in Europe concerned with the transportation of troops and equipment from one place to another. That is always a problem because with all your different states, it's difficult to know whether the bridges in one country are as strong as the bridges in another country. So this headquarters will be dedicated to planning the whole of Europe and making sure that equipment can be moved from place to place. And it's being run by NATO. They've agreed to put it in German. But the interesting thing is that the German army is going to have such control over it that they will be able to use the equipment and the things that NATO has put in for their own use, which I think is rather cheeky, but rather remarkable that Germany has that clout now as far as NATO is concerned. So it'll just get absorbed into this new European army. So things are moving very rapidly. So especially NATO was founded there to keep the Russians out and the Americans in and the Germans down. And now how things are being reversed. The Americans are being thrown out and the Russians are being welcomed in, and Germany is well on the up. So Brexit, just very brief because there's really not a lot to say, but we're in this short time period for negotiations. Both sides seem to be very entrenched. The EU has no flexibility at all. Barnier is a spokesman for 27 other nations, so he hasn't any flexibility to think, let's change things and move there, because he's got to get agreement from 27 other people, so there is no flexibility at all. And the thing is that what Europe hates is competition. And they can see how competitive Britain is going to be once she leaves. And they're in great fear of Britain having a competitive advantage. And so they're determined to block every door that they can so that Britain doesn't gain one over the EU. And Britain's given assurances that that isn't her attitude, that's not what she wants, but that is the inbuilt fear. They don't like competition. See, Britain is going against their dream of this union, because Britain said, no, we're not interested in political union. And Britain's not interested in their army. So the very things that lie at the heart of the EU, Britain's not interested in. So their attitude is, get out and paddle your own canoe. We're not going to help you. The EU's goal is to avoid giving the impression to other EU citizens that to be outside is more interesting than to be inside. That's what they fear, because there's a lot of other EU nations that would love to follow Britain's example. So they're going to make it as difficult as possible. And just this week, I was reading that Australia is very keen that Britain should join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The EU has been trying to join that, but hasn't succeeded. But Australia says, we want Britain, as soon as you can, to join. So that will give her access to Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and a lot of the Asian states. And that will be, that's where the trade is. It's not in Europe, it's in Asia. So that will be an incredible step for Britain. So, they're going to stop that. And the Times had this to say last week. Nothing, even the Brexit referendum vote, ever shakes its elite out of a fixation with political union and promoting those who advocate it. Juncker and Selmayr are wedded to protecting the rigid, legalistic, virtually Napoleonic structure of the EU. So we know that Britain's going to be in difficult times. She's friendly with America. They dislike Trump and what Trump stands for. And it's interesting that Trump, by putting up the barrier with steel and aluminium, putting tariffs on imports, is driving a wedge between America and the EU. Trump has said that those who are friendly to America won't have to pay those tariffs, and those who pay their contributions to NATO won't have to pay. So Britain's in this cleft stick. As long as she's in the EU, she'll have tariffs. As soon as she leaves, then she'll be tariff-free. So again, pressure for Britain to get out as soon as she can. But who's this Selmayr? Is a new name just recently sprung up, but this is the gentleman, as this little bit says, his long-shown disdain and disregard for the traditional workings of the Commission, earning him the nickname Monster of Berlaymont. He is the man that got Juncker into his position. He's the man that works behind the scenes. And just a fortnight ago, he soared from an almost nothingness. He had a lot of power, but no title, to top of the tree as far as the EU workers behind the scenes are concerned. And it's quite a fascinating story. Selmayr may be German, but the move that landed him the top job is known in the world of civil servants by the French term parachutage, whereby a well-connected appointee effectively dropping out of the sky into a plumb post. Now, the commissioners were called together by Juncker, the EU commissioner, for a meeting which was most unusual. He holds very few meetings with his commissioners, but they were summoned to a 9:30 meeting to be told that there wasn't a deputy secretary general of the EU, and that he had decided that Selmayr should have the job. And they were all a bit stunned by this because there'd been no discussion, but there was no other candidate put forward, so they agreed that he should be the Vice Secretary General. A few minutes later, Juncker then announced that the Secretary General, who was expected to be retiring in October, had in fact resigned. And because we now have got a deputy, he automatically becomes the Secretary General. So this was, one of the commissioners says, it was totally stunning. We had witnessed an impeccably prepared and audacious power grab. So this man who put Juncker into power, Juncker now puts him into power, and he is now the head of the whole civil service of the EU. And he is a man who is known not to, in fact, he's the man that appointed Barnier to be the one who should lead the EU discussions about Brexit. Barnier is known to be anti-British, so there is very little hope for Britain. But we could have told them that, because the spirit of prophecy tells us from Scripture that Britain has a role. Scripture has told us Britain has a role outside the EU, no part of the EU. And so we're seeing it happen. And I think that we'll end up without any agreement between the two sides. And Britain will just leave and paddle her own canoe, and God will bless Britain because God has a role for Britain, as we know. Another man to watch is the new Austrian Chancellor, another young man, 31, who has parachuted into power, who was elected. And he is a Roman Catholic and sees Europe as, well, his summary was, what has shaped Europe, what has shaped Austria. We have a culture shaped by a Judeo-Christian heritage and the Enlightenment. And this culture needs protecting, especially at a time of high and rising immigration. Kurz was the man, when he was foreign minister, was the man that managed to stop the tidal flow of immigrants into Austria and onwards into Germany. He's not afraid to stand up for what he believes in, and this includes his own Christian values. Kurtz has surrounded himself with a close circle of dedicated team members, several of whom are practicing Christians. And we shall see a few slides on. He pops up in Russia and is very friendly with Russia. So it's fascinating to see the false prophet and the beast and the dragon, how they cooperate together. The dragon and the beast are cooperating together. Macron is very keen to extend a hand out to Russia. The sanctions against Russia have been pushed by the United States. Europe isn't keen on those, but has had to go along. But people like Macron and Kurtz are very keen to lift the sanctions. They can see that Russia is a partner, should be regarded as a partner, and good for business too. So Macron is, remember when he gave his vision, he was looking to see exchanges of students in different countries so that they thought as Europeans rather than individuals. And again, he wants to set up a similar thing with Russia, where they have exchanges with all sorts of different things there. Also, of course, Merkel is very keen to work with Russia because she is dependent on the gas that is coming, and they're now planning to build a second duplicate line to double the amount of gas. There's been quite a lot of opposition from other EU members, but the tide is now turning, and the pipelines are already being planned and will soon be built. But as I said, Kurtz was in Moscow very recently, last week, and he is Putin's newest ally, supports Russia's move to dominate Europe's energy market. And he came out in support of improving Europe's relationship with Russia and supporting Russian policy positions. So watch this young man. There's a whole drive, not only to integrate Europe, but to reach a hand of friendship over to the dragon power, which we would expect. You know, Revelation tells us these three work together to bring the nations. And we also see the cooperation between the false prophet and the beast. I'm just very brief on this, but the Pope was interviewed last year, and in the interview, the interviewer said, you know, what do you think of a federal Europe? And the Pope replied, the countries of Europe will act if they recognise one truth. Either Europe becomes a federal community, or it will no longer count for anything in the world. And by federal, they mean this coming together, being united, acting in concert. And of course, Article 17 of the Lisbon Treaty binds the EU to consult with the churches, and of course the Roman Catholic Church is the most organised, so that is the one that is always being consulted, and they have got a special office in Brussels specifically for this purpose. And so there is a lot of input behind the scenes. This new face of Europe, of being more having a social policy, that's all being driven by the papacy. And we also see the connection between the false prophet and the dragon. Again, just a very brief summary, but Putin has been to visit popes, John Paul twice, Benedict once, and Francis twice, as well as many phone calls which go between Putin and Francis. Pope Francis has played a huge role in this rapprochement with his approach to the Orthodox Church and his willingness to meet with Patriarch Kirill of Moscow. Relations between the Moscow Patriarch and the Holy See have been encouraged by President Putin. And again, this was a summary back in January from an Italian magazine. 2018 could be the year that Pope Francis makes a historic trip to Moscow. Two recent statements have confirmed the birth of a new diplomatic trend. The synchronicity between the Vatican and Vladimir Putin in terms of foreign policy is visibly growing. Pope Francis is in a hurry to go to Russia, and Vladimir Putin is ready to welcome him with open arms. And that will be a big step binding the two legs. The papacy has got to bind the 2 feet together. So, Russia, again, only a few slides here. Time is well gone. So we see how she's really established a firm foothold, not only in Syria, but in Lebanon and in Egypt. She's strengthening her Black Sea fleet so that in the terms of Daniel chapter 12, she can come forth with many ships. And she has established herself as the prime power in the Middle East. And at that Munich Security Conference, the leaders had to very grudgingly acknowledge this uncomfortable truth that Russia is critical to resolving many of the world's worst conflicts. In other words, we can't shut Russia off, we have to work with her. So we know in last year, 2017, the bases, 2 main bases, which she has in Syria, she now has got an agreement with the Syrians to have permanency there, 49-year lease and extending 25 years. She's free to do whatever she likes in these 2 bases. They're to be regarded as Russian territory, and they can do what they like there. So not only has she got these 2 bases, there are 4 other bases which she's busy building. So far from saying, well, the battle's over in Syria, we're leaving, she is hunkering down in Syria. And not only Syria, but into Lebanon and into Egypt. She's talking with Libya about bases there. She has the use of an old Soviet base in Egypt. And at the end of last year, she had an agreement with Egypt that she can use any of the Egyptian Air Force bases as long as she gives 5 days' notice. It's a reciprocal agreement, but one can't really see Egyptian aeroplanes wanting to use bases in Russia. It's all a one-way thing. The Sudani president was in Russia recently and was talking about allowing Russia to have a base in the Red Sea. So you can see just how Russia is expanding herself, circling Turkey, because that's her next place to take, and encircling Europe as well. So, very briefly then, just Israel and the Gulf. We see increasing alliances with the Arab nations, with Israel. It's been going on for a long time, but in the last year, and this year especially, speeded up. The battle in Yemen, perhaps, is coming to a bit of a conclusion, because we know that Yemen has to be part of the Southern Alliance. This is the Sheba, of the Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish. Iran has been the power behind the rebels in Yemen, and maybe with steps which are being taken now, that will be curbed. The Saudi Crown Prince has been revolutionising Saudi Arabia. We know this week has been in London, and we'll look very briefly at that. But the other incredible thing is this drive, as far as Britain is concerned, to focus trade on Israel. Sees Israel as a very important focus, not only Israel, but also the Gulf. That's what the talks with Saudi Arabia were about. Energy, as far as Israel is concerned, new wells are coming on stream, and Jerusalem, of course, is the big issue. So this was from 3 weeks ago, was it? Saudi Arabia's unholy alliance with Israel. It's fair to say that there is a strong alliance, political, military, intelligence alliance between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and we conclude the UAE. Saudi Arabia has expedited the race, the closer relationship with Israel, which, as I said, began a long time ago. So the Crown Prince went to Britain via Egypt, and at Egypt he met with leaders of the Israel. They met at Egypt, and the report said the meeting focused on the normalisation of ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and included Saudi Arabia's commitment to the deal of the century, the Middle East peace plan being devised by President Trump and his administration. Within that framework, Israel will take a part in the unprecedented real estate venture being sponsored by the Saudis in the Gulf of Aqaba, the NEOM, which we'll look at in a moment. So what this Crown Prince wants to do is to move Saudi away from dependence upon oil and to take it into a trading position, which I find so fascinating because, you know, the merchants of Tarshish are wanting to trade, and so here's a trading nation welcoming, like Tyre of old, different countries to come in, help them build this huge city, free trade city. So it's the scale is just mind-blowing, and the cost of $50 billion. So let's just look at the map. It's on the top corner. It's where one of the original Dedans lived. So it's on the corner there, close to Egypt, Jordan, and Israel. It's called NEOM, the New Future, the world's most ambitious project intended to become a transnational city, an economic zone, a free trade zone, like in Dubai. He's seen the success of the Dubai free zone, and he wants to set up the same here. Now, he needs British skills. Britain is very good at organising, building big cities and transportation and all the rest of it. He needs Israel because it needs a vast amount of energy to bring gas from Israel, and Israel will have an excess of gas, is a relatively short route compared with bringing it much, much longer. So he's very keen for Israeli help, not only in energy, but water desalination and also in energy conservation. So both Israel and Britain are being pulled into this region. And it's so fascinating because this is at the bottom end of Edom, Moab and Ammon. And it's interesting that when Gog comes down, he avoids coming down that territory. Now, it could well be that if Britain and Israel and America are heavily involved in this area here, that Gog will think twice about coming down that part and will skirt down the coastline into Egypt and then back up to Jerusalem. Just a bit of a throwaway line. So as far as energy is concerned, Tamar has been going since 2013 and bringing in good money to Israel. Egypt has their Zohar well, not very far away from the Leviathan, and the Cyprus has the Aphrodite field there. That's the Leviathan field. So there are three big fields which are currently being developed, and all three have got to decide how we're going to deal with all this gas that's going to come. And so there's been a lot of talk about linking the three fields together and back to their original countries so that each country can benefit. But it's what do you do with the excess? Now, the simplest thing is a route into Turkey. But with the situation vis-a-vis Turkey and Israel, that's a no-no, and Turkey and Egypt, it's a no-no. So that seems to have been knocked on the head. So there's a lot of talk about a route which will be a very ambitious one, an undersea pipeline from Cyprus across to Crete, and then onwards into Greece, and then upwards into the EU. The EU is prepared to back that. It's spending EU money for all the research on the route of it. But it will be a very ambitious, it's very deep. The Mediterranean is very deep. And it will be a remarkable pipeline if it ever does get built. So that's one of the things that are being talked about. But at the moment, just suddenly in the last couple of weeks, 3 weeks, Egypt has agreed to buy gas from Israel. Quite a remarkable change. CISI has set up that private companies can deal with Israel and not be penalised for it. There are two liquid gas plants in Egypt which are idle because there's no excess gas to turn into liquid gas. And so the idea is that they're going to buy gas from Israel to those, and the capacity of those could absorb Cyprus's as well as gas from their own Egyptian one. If that took place, that will be a remarkable cementing of friendship between Israel and Egypt, traditional enemies, but signed a peace talk many years ago, which has been a cold peace, but with all the other developments. And of course, Saudi Arabia is pushing Egypt to be more friendly to Israel. They can see the way the things are going. Another thing which is about to take off is a different approach. Instead of putting gas pipeline, which is very expensive to lay, is to lay an electric cable to bring gas ashore either in Israel or in Cyprus, and use gas turbines to generate electricity and then supply electricity to the EU instead of supplying gas. Now that's had a tremendous boost just very recently, that a firm, Quantum, are wanting to lay a subsea fibre optic cable to run from Israel across, linking up with all of Europe and ending up in northern Spain, which will then link up with the existing cable which runs across the Atlantic to America. So America will be at one end and Israel at the other of this high-speed fibre optics cable. Now, the idea is that if they lay this electric cable, they can lay this at the same time. And so for the first third of the journey, they can share costs. And so they're prepared to put in $200 million to lay this cable and to bring the Middle East and Europe into the 21st century. As a country, Israel has been doing well. Her exports rose 5%, largely due to the gas coming from Tamar, and she's in good state. So Sheba, Dedan, merchants of Tarshish and all their young lions. And this again is the fascinating thing, that Britain, although she abandoned Israel, turned her back and said, get on with it, she's now being drawn back. And people like Mrs. May, who because of her childhood being brought up as a clergyman's daughter, has an interest in Israel, and she is very keen. And the BICOM, which is the British Israel Communication Research Centre, it's up there, isn't it? Put out this fascinating pamphlet at the end of the year talking about, after Brexit, the trade that Britain and Israel can do. Britain is a bit restrained at the moment. As a member of the EU, she can't do all that she wants to do. So they're laying the plans of how the trade can be boosted. And just last week it was announced that Prince William is making the first state visit. For 70 years, the whole time the state of Israel has been there, no official UK visit has been made to Israel. That is now being put right, and William is going as part of the celebrations for the 70th anniversary of the State of Israel. And as it said, it's a sign of Israel's importance to the UK. Britain's exported goods and services to Israel are $4.3 billion. Exports to Saudi Arabia are a few $1 billion higher, but Israel has also much to offer Britain that the Saudis can't. Israel exported to Britain to the tune of $5.1 billion. Israel has important technological innovations, and the two countries share important intelligence information as well. They're wedded together, and this is so fascinating, isn't it? Because the merchants of Tarshish are establishing themselves, not only in Israel, but in the Middle East. And this is bin Salman, on Wednesday was it, and they're talking about 65 to 100 billion pounds worth of trade and investment. And a memorandum of interest was signed in 48 of the Typhoon jets. But it was interesting what bin Salman said, that Britons and Saudis will be safer if we have a strong relationship. It's all part of this drive, as Brother Clive was saying, to peace and safety in this region. It will come. The prophets have said it will come. And Trump recognises so. What was so interesting was the nations that didn't attend the conference that the Turkish Prime Minister called of the Islamic nations, the Islamic Summit Conference, in protest at what Trump had declared, that these countries in the south didn't go. And those are the countries that we know form the alliance with Israel. They're not part of the northern tribes, the northern invader. So, we see Scripture being fulfilled before our eyes. And again, just yesterday in Debka, Trump, because Netanyahu's, I think, is still in America, he said that the US is going to use her troops in Syria to obstruct Iran's push into Syria. Now, that would be a big, bold move on the part of America, but she has said she's going to move her troops there to avoid this pressure being put on Israel. So again, we see the young lions involved in the defence of Israel. And also, if we just go back there, the Americans are intending to move troops into Saudi Arabia. Remember in 2003, under Bush, when the Gulf War took place, the Saudis said to the American troops, "You've got to leave." Well, now they're wanting them to come back. So it is planned that this year America will move a lot of her troops back into Saudi Arabia. So not only Britain there, but the chiefest of the young lions, very busy in Saudi Arabia. Well, we've heard Nikki Haley, and the Vice President of America was addressing the Knesset in January, and again he used biblical terms, biblical language. The winds of change already witnessed across the Middle East. Long-standing enemies are becoming partners. Old foes are finding new ground for cooperation. The descendants of Isaac and Ishmael are coming together in common cause as never before. So I'll just skip these. That was my exhortation. So that's the snippets. The snippets are the items that I gather off the news every week and send them off 2 or 3 times a week. But just send me an email for those. So I'm sorry with all the interruptions. We've gone on so long, but so much is happening, brothers and sisters. We should be, of all men, most excited because we see the hand of God working so openly among the nations, and the things which our forefathers, brethren, anticipated, we're seeing come to pass very rapidly before our eyes. Thank you.